Give me a little bit of a insight into where you were at in life when On the Road by Kerouac entered the pictures.
I was probably 16, 17. So I was living in Hollywood, teenage junkie. All my friends were dying of overdoses. You know, we were living that really grungy, fucked up life.
So who tells you about the book, or how do you come across it?
Nobody. I saw this book and the words just shot out into my consciousness like lightning. It just hit me on the road. And I took this book and I went back and I read it, and suddenly I was like, this is the way out. This is the way out.
Welcome to the Syndicate X Library, where we love books. Today we're talking about a book that changed somebody's life. That somebody is Jonathan Shaw. He is an author, famous tattoo artist. He has some incredible stories, some of which involve advice he got from Charles Bukowski. He is very kind, interesting, has a depth of experience that you would hope you would have in a lifetime. And the book that changed his life is On the Road by good old Jack Kerouac. This is coconut water?
This is coconut water.
Oh, thank you.
Cold.
Oh, wow. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Coffee?
Thank you.
Coconut water gives you lots of potassium.
It's pretty much all I drink.
Whenever I start cramping at the gym, I'll drink some coconut water and it usually takes it away.
I drink coconut water constantly. That's the only thing I drink.
How many books a year do you read?
You know, currently, not a whole lot, because I'm involved in this film process, you know, so there was times in my life when I would just constantly read, other times in my life when I would constantly write, constantly, obsessively, just eat, sleep, write. And there was other times when I would read and write, eat, sleep, read, write. And currently, I'm in a different kind of situation. I'm in a more interactive kind of phase, you know. We go through phases. I don't know if we all do, but I do. So right now I'm doing a lot of painting, I'm doing a lot of artwork, and I'm doing a lot of interactive stuff like this. Since the documentary came out, which was inspired by my books, I've had the opportunity to sort of go around the world to film festivals and theatrical presentations of the film, and have a lot of press interactions, which I've done before because of, you know, when my books came out, I was on press tours, you know, doing interviews and interacting with the public and doing Q&As. And so now I'm doing that in conjunction with the movie release. And so it's put me in a more of a spoken word kind of situation. It's been a while that I've been more interacting with the world through actual conversations like this. And just, I'm known as a tattoo artist. I was actually at one stage of my life, I was one of the most famous tattoo artists in the world. And I stepped away from that 20-something years ago because I had something of a, my life went to shit. And as a result of that, I had a huge life-changing spiritual awakening, which led me out of my daily career as a renowned sort of tattoo artist. And I just walked away from it completely. And I spent the better part of the ensuing 15 years writing books obsessively. And I published 3 pretty big, hefty books, one after the other. And that was the time when I was reading, writing, mostly writing, but reading too. And then they made this movie, and the movie covered my sort of my career as a tattoo artist as a foundational thing. And through that process, eventually that led me back to tattooing full time. So for the last couple of years, I've been basically touring the world and just tattooing literally, like eat, sleep, tattoo, and travel. I've been driving by car across the country. I think I've crisscrossed this country maybe 6 or 7 times in the last 2 years, and also Mexico and also Brazil, all by car.
What kind of car?
Just an old cop car,
Like a
Crown Victoria.
Crown Vic? Those are the best. When was it that you quit tattooing? Like what year?
Probably around 2001.
And then when did you take it back up?
What are we in? 2024? 24. So I'd say probably around 2 years ago, 2022.
Is there muscle memory? Is it easy to pick it back up?
It's like riding a motorcycle, you never forget, Actually, I've gotten a lot better because taking those decades off, when I came back, because I hated it. Not only did I hate it, I hated myself because I was an alcoholic and a heroin addict through most of my career at functional. And when I finally crashed and burned and, ate shit and died 1,000 deaths, I hit rock bottom with everything. And then I realized, I have to change everything in my life to recover from this spiritual malady, this, mental illness, this insanity, this self-destructive, parasite in my consciousness. And so I had a huge sort of enlightening, what they call a moment of truth, where I just said, I have to abandon everything I think I know and change directions completely in my life. And at that point, I moved back to Brazil. I hung up my, illustrious career and moved back to Brazil and basically just started writing obsessively and excavating my own soul through that process. So,
and did you clean up during that?
I've been clean and sober for 23 years. Yeah. Yeah. And I've been on a, pretty diligent spiritual quest for that entire time. And in that context, the writing has been probably my closest connection to what I like to think of as the source of all healing and, the creator, whatever you want to call it, God, consciousness, whatever, it goes by many names, but, that's through, I think there's like somewhere in my book there, I've written something and I did the voiceover for the movie with little excerpts here and there from stuff that I'd written in these books. One of the final lines of the movie that they asked me to recite in voiceover was money, property, prestige, fame and fortune, liquor and drugs. They were all nothing but a means to an end for me. But ultimately, the quest for redemption through art has been the only thing I ever did that didn't end up in the fucking toilet. And then the movie closes with that quote. I guess they pulled that from one of my books.
It's pretty profound, though.
It's my findings. It's what I discovered in my. There was another one. The movie, they managed to handpick a few gems out of this book that fit into the general narrative, and luckily we had a good story editor because one of the directors was really good at making things look cool, and one of the other director. There was 2 directors, was basically clueless. Thank God I actually insisted that they work with a story editor because I realized there was a story that needed to be pieced together out of all this 10 years worth of material that they compiled and filmed. And, I'd given them access to my personal archives, which are huge because, I come from a long line of tortured souls with raging artistic egos and, famous people. There was a lot of archives that I gave them access to, but there was also years of them following me around, the world, doing this and doing that. And so they had all this material but they didn't have a story. And the one director was very talented in his niche, didn't really know how to put together this as a story. And the other director was, lost in the woods. And so I said, well, you're going to need to find a professional story editor to take all this material, all my books, a screenplay that I've written. You've got everything you need. You've got all the material. You've gone out. You've interviewed all these incredible people. You've got ingredients to make the most incredible thing cinematically, but you don't have a fucking story, and I'm busy. I've already done the footwork. So find a professional story editor to work with who knows how to make a beginning, a middle, and an end happen. And I'm off to the beach. And they did. And interestingly enough, that story editor's name was Grace. When people ask me if I like the movie, considering that I wrote, powerful works of literature, and I can say this with all humility because I don't feel like it was me that wrote this stuff. I mean, I suited up and I showed up and I put pen to paper and I joined forces with whatever higher powers exist that I could be a channel for. And so I can say with great humility that these are great works of literature because I didn't make them. I was just opened myself up to channel this universal goodness of storytelling through this humble vessel. So I'm not taking credit for shit. Without that connection, I'm nothing. As a writer, as an artist, as a human being. So, all credit to my creator, who I think I found a relationship with through desperation and the willingness to show up and let that little voice be told, that voice of that tortured, lost little child be told through, this flawed vessel. So people ask me, well, did you like the way the movie came out? And I can say, yeah, it was only successful in its presentation of the essence of a story through the grace of God. And interestingly enough, the catalyst for that was this story editor that I insisted they hire because they showed me a rough cut. And I was so appalled by what they thought would be presentable as a film. I was just like, are you fucking kidding? Listen, here's the deal. You're going to hire a professional story editor and let them work with this material, or I'm going to pull the fucking plug on this whole project. And they'd already invested a bunch of money, and they were like, So that happened, and they found her, and her name was Grace. And to me, I find that really significant and ironic and cool. And I hope to do other projects with her of my own direction. So
it's great.
Yeah.
So the book we're talking about today, On the Road by Kerouac, give me a little bit of a insight into where you were at in life when that entered the picture. So how old were you?
I was probably 16, 17.
Where did you live at that point?
I lived in a cheap rooming house room somewhere in the ass end of Hollywood. I was a teenage junkie, strung out like a lab rat.
So you were on heroin?
Oh, yeah. Heroin, alcohol.
How old were you when you tried heroin?
Same age, 16, 17. All my friends were, there's a lot of stories in these books. So I was living in Hollywood, teenage junkie, strung out like a lab rat. All my friends were dying of overdoses. We were living that really grungy, fucked up life.
How are you sustaining that at that point? Are you working? Are you a musician?
I worked at
artist?
a lot of stuff. I was never really a musician. My father was a super famous musician. My father was Artie Shaw. But I had no father because my father, Papa was a Rolling Stone. I didn't have any relationship with my father until much later in life.
So how did you support your habit?
I was working. I was working in Hollywood. I was working as an assistant to prop masters. I was doing grip work. I was driving trucks for, until things got really, really bad. I was, selling drugs. I was, I had some of the weirdest jobs. I was working in the kitchens of restaurants. I was doing what a kid of that age would do to sustain himself. We were also doing B&Es. We were breaking into doctors' offices and stealing their stuff and selling it. We had all kinds of little things going on. So I was, at some point, I was spiraling downward in that downward trajectory, and I was living, as a strung-out junkie lives, just stealing and robbing and scamming and just taking enough drugs just to not be sick. The party was long over. And during that time, I was writing a lot. I was writing.
Even at that age?
Oh, yeah. I started writing when I was probably 15. Yeah, I wrote a lot.
Who tells you about the book, or how do you come across it?
Nobody. That's the thing. When I was in that situation, I remember I was desperately seeking a way out. I didn't know I was seeking a way out, but I remember I was walking down Hollywood Boulevard, just shuffling along like this lost soul. And there was a newsstand, 24-hour newsstand at the corner of Cahuenga and Hollywood. They had everything in there. They had porno mags. They had newspapers from all over the world. They had a whole section of books in the back. They had like a paperback book rack. And I just wandered into that place one day, and I saw this book on the shelf. And I knew nothing of Kerouac, even though I was kind of a literary kid. I mean, I liked to read a lot, and I'd read a bunch of stuff, but I'd never heard of Jack Kerouac, knew nothing of the Beats. I'd interacted with Bukowski. I actually was a frequent visitor to his house, to his hovel.
When you were like 16 or 17?
Yeah.
So you would go to his house and just knock on the door, or what?
Yeah.
And what would you guys talk about?
Writing, life, chicks, just whatever. Just bullshit, And we would. What
were you trying to do by seeking him out? Were you trying to learn how to be a writer?
No, I was writing. I wrote for a. You remember the LA Free Press used to have a column by an unknown writer named Charles Bukowski called Notes of a Dirty Old Man. And he had a weekly column in the LA Free Press. And at some point I submitted something to the LA Free Press and they published it. So I was published in the same birdcage liner as my hero. And, I was stoked like a log cabin conflagration with that, And so I pestered some older chick that worked there to give me his address, because nobody had phones back then, and so I got his address. And I'd heard, that people would go over there and, sort of knock on his door. So I did. And I stopped at the liquor store and bought a case of beer and a pint of I think it was Old Crow or something like that. And I went and knocked on his door, and he was in there typing away at this little kitchenette cubicle where he'd sit and type.
Could you hear him typing?
Yeah, you could hear him typing. He was right. You could see him. You could see him inside, the cloudy window, and he's there typing away on the kitchen.
He just knocked on the door?
And I sort of rapped on the window, and he didn't even turn around. He was like, "Who are you? What do you want?" And I was like, "I write for the Free Press." He was like, "Yeah, go away." And I was like, "I got some beers and a pint." He was like, "Yeah, all right." And he got up and opened the door, and that was our first visit. And then, I visited with him a bunch of times after that. We got in a drunken punch-up, I think the first or second time we met. We got into a drunken, discussion that ended up in, we came to blows, and he knocked the shit out of me. I was a skinny little, 18-year-old kid. But we were friendly. We were friendly.
Did you learn anything from him?
I learned about Celine. who became one of my favorite writers. And I can't, we just hung out, I don't know. We would drink. A lot of my life back then was a blur, but he did give me the most important advice I've ever gotten as a writer. Because I had tons of scraps of short stories and poems that I'd written, and these things, were splattered with blood from me shooting up, and carbon stains on the papers from me cooking up heroin in a spoon and setting it down on the pages. And I'd go over there with these reams of demented writing, and I'd show it to him, and let me read you a poem, and let me read you this, or let me read you that, and he'd read me something of his, and I'd read him some of mine. And at some point he said to me, you're nothing but a fucking shit-brained kid with a lot of loud talk, and a $10 typer don't make you a fucking writer. My advice to you is you get the fuck out of here and go out and do some fucking living.
And he's saying, like, go get some life experience?
Yeah, basically. I think that was how I interpreted it.
That would make you a better writer if you actually had some life experience?
Well, he didn't say it in those fancy words, but I think that's what, he meant. At least that's what I took from it when I finally crashed and burned and died 1,000 deaths and kicked cold turkey, my heroin habit. The first thing I did was steal a couple $100, from my mother's purse, and I didn't live with my mother, but I would go over there sometimes, and that's a whole other story. But so the first thing I did was steal a couple $100 from my mother's purse, pack an overnight bag, from the fucking Salvation Army, sling it over my shoulder, walk down to the fucking freeway, stick out my thumb, and then I ended up in Mexico. But the thing is, before that, I stole this book from the all-night newsstand.
So you stole it? You didn't buy it?
Yeah, I didn't buy anything, man.
Okay, so you take it back to wherever you were?
I saw the title of the book. I didn't know anything from Bukowski. I didn't know anything from the Beats or anything. I'd met Bukowski. We'd hung out. That was about as much as I knew of anything, I tried to read Henry Miller. I'd read a lot of stuff at that point. I grew up reading Lovecraft, Ray Bradbury, Mark Twain, whatever. I read whatever I could get my hands on, Upton Sinclair, The Jungle. I knew some stuff, but my education was totally piecemeal because I dropped out of school. I didn't go to school after junior high, so I just hit the streets. I came from a very dysfunctional alcoholic family where people were suiciding all around me. And, my parents were well-known people. My mother was a movie star. Frequent visitors at my home were, the likes of Marlon Brando, Marilyn Monroe, Tony Curtis, Cary Grant. But it was a shit show. They were alcoholic people, highly self-destructive, and I grew up in that fucking horrible, environment. So I hit the street when I was like 14 and found my own way.
Well, so when you get the book, where do you go to start reading it?
Well, to my little hovel in Hollywood, my little flea bag room in the rooming house. So, I took the book. I saw this book, and the words just shot out into my consciousness like lightning. It just hit me on the road. And I took this book, and I went back and I read it, I devoured it, and then I read it again. And suddenly I was like, this is the way out. This is the way out. Anyway, I sweated out the dope demons in this dirty little room, went through all 7 corners of hell and came out of that. And, this is all described very meticulously in writing in my books, these 2 books, Scab Vendor, Confessions of a Tattoo Artist, and Homeward Bound, Confessions of a Tattoo Artist, Book 2. So, I really went deep into these memories in these, memoirs. But So, I stuck out my thumb on the freeway and ended up in Mexico and bummed around Mexico with basically no money for quite a while, just surviving.
So the takeaway from the book is adventure? What is the book inspiring you to do that you go on that trip?
I guess you could say adventure, but there's more to it than that. For me, at the time, I just saw it as a roadmap to salvation, if that makes sense.
And what is salvation?
Well, the opposite of what I had was, total, pitiful, incomprehensible demoralization on a visceral level as a strung out, lost, tortured soul of a fucking teenage junkie with, all the ingredients of resentment and victimhood and horror and just hatred, self-hatred and hatred of everything in the world and everything in it. Just the torture of being a drug addict and all the, foul roots of that dis-ease that, those roots go all the way into the depths of hell. So, when you ask me, what do I mean by salvation? I mean, to an unconscious being like that, salvation would be anything offering a way out.
What in the book inspired that?
Everything. Just his total quest for, there's a quote from the book somewhere where he says, the only ones for me are the mad ones. You know that quote? Mm-hmm. Mad to live, mad to, everything in that quote. I can't pull it up right now. But, that kind of summarizes everything, the spirit of the book that I read. I mean, I was really young. I read that book and I was like, I have to just do something like that.
Do you think that Bukowski's advice and that went hand in hand?
To me, they did.
So the world was kind of sending you a message in a sense. There was a synchronicity.
That's how I interpret it from where I sit now today, looking back over this weird sort of magical confluence of circumstances that, named my life. Yeah, exactly that. I think those were two key ingredients, sort of pinpoints on the roadmap of this journey. This book, I haven't read it in decades, but I remember parts of it vividly. And later in my writing, somewhere in my writing, I wrote about this after writing these two books, these two memoirs, that took me all through the travels and the times of working on ships and, learning to tattoo in dockside dives, on the coasts of Mexico and later in Brazil and all through Central and South America, traveling like a real hobo through all those, my teenage into my early 20s like that. In that context, I went back and I reread On the Road to see what the fuck I was referring to. And I read it real fast, and I realized something I had not remembered, that the book ended up, him and Dean Moriarty ended up in fucking Mexico at the end of the book. They ended up in Mexico going on these wild tears through fucking whorehouses and drunken nights and magical Mexico. And I was like, holy shit, the book ends up in Mexico, and that's what I went and lived, totally unconsciously. I was seeking to, emulate the adventures of this young man who wrote this amazing work, and I did, by God, and then some. I think I was having a Q&A session at the last premiere of my movie with a close friend who's actually one of my favorite living authors. You might know him, Jerry Stahl. He wrote an amazing book. He's written a number of amazing books. He's probably my one of my favorite living writers. He wrote a book called Permanent Midnight. They made a movie out of his book, starring Ben Stiller playing him, because his book's a junkie memoir too. And he's somebody you should talk to. Jerry Stahl, man. If you don't know who that is,
I'll order the book.
You should read Permanent Midnight. And he wrote another book called Perv, a Love Story. And he just came out with another book called 999, where he went and visited the concentration camps in Germany. And I mean, he's an amazing author. He's well known.
Did you ever go back to heroin?
I did in the 90s. I was, I never sobered up. When I left the States, I never went back to heroin, but I became a tremendous alcoholic. So I drank obsessively, all through Mexico and South America, and then eventually found cocaine, and that was a big party. Eventually, I wound up back in the States in the early 80s, got sober. So I was stark raving sober for about 10 years, and that was during the years when I was tattooing and became a big shot in the tattoo game. And eventually, I was so unhinged that I just started playing around with liquor and drugs again, and eventually that took me to my, my true spiritual bottom. And that was 23 years ago when I threw in the towel once and for all and, sought recovery, like with all the desperation of a drowning guy seizing onto a life preserver. So, that's...
Is it harder to kick the second time?
The only hard thing about relinquishing the only thing that gives you comfort in this world is the mental anguish and the spiritual angst that arises when you realize suddenly you're stripped raw of every chance of feeling at home in your own skin. The physical.
Wow.
The physical.
That's one of the best descriptions I think I've heard.
The physical kick is like it's like getting a cold compared to the mental and spiritual agony of having to face life on life's terms without the ease and comfort of the only thing that gives you any sense of being okay. So that's when, it's, Carl Jung said it best. He said, God enters through the wound. So I had to open that wound and vivisect my own soul in the process of finding peace and comfort without liquor and drugs. And that's where writing became my connection to those forces that can actually restore a lunatic to sanity. So
have you ever, and I don't know that you would want to read the book, but I'm just curious. Mark Lanigan wrote a book, Sing Backwards and Weep. Have you ever heard of it? No?
Have not. But it sounds interesting.
Do you know what Mark Lanigan is?
I don't think I do. Like I say, my education is jigsaw puzzle. It's sporadic. I mean, I'm sort of self-educated.
He's an incredible songwriter, but he wrote a couple books, but this one is kind of about his experience in heroin and drugs, and he was very close with Kurt Cobain and Lane Staley. It's an incredible book, but the thing that always something I noticed that is interesting to me is that he would say, I'm getting sick and I need to get well, and get well meant to do heroin.
Yeah.
And it's exactly the opposite of what is going on.
Sure.
But it's what's going on. And that contradiction is a razor blade in a sense, right? Because
sure.
you're trying to avoid the thing that's controlling you.
Yeah.
And he said in the book, like he would wake up and he was going to quit heroin, but he just needed to score today.
Yeah. Just to
and
get
that was
well.
every day.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
He had every intention of quitting. Just, I got to score so then I can get well.
Get well. Yeah. I mean, that's a common theme. I mean, any junkie will tell you, once the party's over and you are strung out like a fucking lab rat, then it's all about getting well. You're not going to get high anymore. You're not going to be partying anymore. You're just going to get well.
Yeah.
Because if you don't, you're going to
get sick.
Get thrust into the depths of fucking, fiery hell, So at that point,
that tension and contradiction is
I mean, there's been a lot of authors that have, sort of emerged in the last, I don't know, couple decades when, sort of recovery became sort of fashionable, especially in places like, Southern California, LA, there's the whole Beverly Hills recovery thing,
Oh yeah, for $70,000 a month, you can come to my place in Malibu and
all those kind of places, all that kind of thing. I mean, so
it's big business.
It's a huge business, and it's basically what they're doing in these places is they're charging $100,000 for a copy of the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous.
Yeah, but the view's better in Malibu.
Yeah, but I mean, maybe the view's better in Malibu than in a church basement, a smoky room. But the bottom line is,
it's the same path.
It's the same path, and it's a well-worn path, and it works. For millions of people all over the world. Doesn't matter where you come from or what your situation is, it's redemptive. But interestingly enough, there's this whole culture that's grown up around it, which is largely, fueled by enormous amounts of bullshit and smoke and mirrors and lots of money. And it's all good, whatever it takes.
What are the smoke and mirrors specifically?
Oh, I mean, there's a million different versions of that. There's I can't even begin to go into it. It's just the whole culture of that's grown up around the simple principles.
Like recovery's become a lifestyle? Is that what you mean?
No, it's just become fashionable in a certain
lifestyle.
way. Fashionable in kind of a superficial, weird sort of way. And, there's been all these writers who have written, I mean, even, like Hunter Biden wanted to write a book like that, I mean, everybody's trying to get in, and be like, the next cool recovery writer. There's all these, some of them, became bestsellers, some of these books, and I've read a couple of them and I was just like, this doesn't feel terribly authentic, and then somebody asked me, when I was doing a book tour for my first book, which isn't the memoir, but it's a real dark book that also has a lot of addiction and recovery references in it. But, my shit's dark, man, and it's darkly, there's a strong sense of irony because, some of my mentors were like Bukowski and Celine. I mean, I've never laughed so hard as when reading parts of Celine or Bukowski. And so one interviewer, I think it was the New York Times book review in Mexico City, when my book got translated into Spanish, and he was asking, I speak Spanish, as well as I speak English, and he was asking me like, well, how would you define your genre as a writer? And I was like, I wouldn't. And then I thought for a second, and I heard the words come out of my mouth, and I said, but if I had to give you a genre, I guess I would name it slapstick tragedy. And the only other...
That's great.
I thought so, it was given to me. I can't take credit for it. Thank you, whoever is giving me these things. But so the only other writer, I keep mentioning Jerry Stahl because he's I consider this guy one of my favorite living writers because he's writing is slapstick tragedy. And he does write in the sort of, recovered addict genre shtick, but he writes with it so, just so with the darkest of humor. He's got that Jewish angst thing going on, and it's brilliant mind. And he just writes in way. I mean, I cracked up when I read his tragic story. And that's, what I like about Celine. That's what I like about Bukowski. That's what I like about my own stuff, is we work in that slapstick tragedy realm, where, we're going to describe and this is something you see in, 12-step meetings. You'll see people talking about the most horrendous, horrible things that they've done. And suddenly the whole room just bursts into laughter. This is what heals, man. When you take yourself too seriously, you're fucked. You're not going to get there.
There's this new thing going on that I think I hear like a couple times a week where people will say they're trying to learn how to love themselves. And I'm always like, the fuck, love yourself, like yourself. We're not so great. Like, how do you take yourself?
Thank you.
I'm not that great. Love yourself is a pretty high bar. Why don't you just like yourself?
Yeah, well, it's we're not accept yourself, with all your warts. That's
it's more fun to have a sense of humor about yourself than to put yourself on a pedestal.
Fuck yeah, I love that. Yeah. Well, that's I guess
you gotta be able to laugh at the parts of you
the tragedy, the absurdity, the human condition. It's a clown car, man. God, Celine said some of the most brilliant things. What did he say? He said, "Love is." What did he say? I mean, I've quoted all these different authors when they have these incredible quotes. Celine said, "Love is the infinite in the possession of poodles," something like that. There's just so much greatness swirling around in the universe, and being sort of grabbed onto by these great authors and thinkers and performers or whatever, and I just stand in awe of it all, and there's another quote that I like, like good writers borrow, great writers steal. That's a good one. I've stolen plenty, just made it my own. Just like, oh, this will fit in good right here. Hey, so sue me. It's my job to take whatever's floating around out there and make this jigsaw puzzle into something cohesive, coherent, and engaging and fun for all the sickness.
When you're writing a book, do you imagine the audience?
I want to write a book that I would like to read, because there's so many books that I'll open the book and read the first 2 pages and be like, nah, trash pile.
So you're weighing it against an equilibrium of what is good and worthy.
Well, in my estimation, I mean, I would, there's books that I can't put down because they're just they speak to me so well, and in a language that I find, fascinating. I can't stop reading, even if it's like watching a slow motion train wreck. That's it, I want it to be accessible in a way that's engaging, that's in a way that, reaches into your fucking soul and grabs you. And a lot of stuff ain't like that, man. I'll read the first 2 pages and go, this is fucking mediocre, birdcage liner, gone.
Birdcage liner,
cat pox liner, whatever,
Do you have a favorite Bukowski book?
I couldn't remember that far back, but I mean, I remember the first books I read of Bukowski was all a compilation of all those stories that it was all the stories that he wrote in the weekly column in the Free Press, the place in New Direction, San Francisco, Ferlinghetti's place. They made a book, nice book of short stories, and I think it was called Notes of a Dirty Old Man.
Yeah.
And I just read those short stories, man. They were so fucking great. And I'd already read a lot of them because they were in the Free Press. But that was my favorite book because it was all these 2-3 pagers. And each one of them was just, the copulating mermaid of Venice, California. Remember that one?
Mm-mm.
Oh my God, that was one of the greatest stories ever. I mean, he wrote some dark fucking shit, but it was so hilarious. What a mind, what a great, yeah, so I like those books a lot.
What do you think he was tapped into? If there's a higher creative power, you think it's the same one you tap into?
Well, I don't know if it's the same exact entity, but I think there's definitely if there's like a fleet of spirits out there that are like, yeah, let's throw them a little bit of this. I'm sure they belong to the same club.
they know each other.
I think we've definitely got some. Yeah, we got some cohorts in common.
So, biggest takeaway from On the Road. What is if you had to summarize the biggest takeaway, what is it?
I guess just no rules, man.
No rules.
No rules. Because Kerouac, he didn't have no rules, I think he was a intuitive writer. I don't know much about his life. I mean, I've read this and that, but he was the first gonzo writer. It wasn't Hunter Thompson. I knew Hunter. I met Hunter. But Kerouac was the actual, maybe not, but he was, at least in this generation, he was totally gonzo in the fact that, his approach to writing defines that genre in that, he was a guy that just told his story but it was a big story. It was a story about other people. There was all these alter ego characters in his stories, but he expressed himself. He kind of kept himself as like the little guy, narrating. But on the other hand, he was Dean Moriarty. It was kind of like, Dean Moriarty was like his Ed McMahon to, his Johnny Carson or kind of thing. He was projecting, he was in love with Dean Moriarty's adventurous, crazy, lustful spirit, but that's because he was there too. He was part of that, So, what I would take from the book is like no rules because he just lived it and had the wherewithal to put it all down on paper,
And do you, when you say no rules, do you mean no limitations?
No, I mean as a writer and as a human being too, but as a writer, I mean, he was just a seeker, man, and, he wrote all those other books, Big Sur and all that stuff where he went off on his own spiritual quest. I guess it didn't work out so good because he died a bitter old alcoholic, but, hats off to that too. But I guess I would say that the no rules thing applies to his approach to literature, because there wasn't a lot of guys that were, free form, that was not considered maybe cool by the literary establishment of his day, perhaps, and he was just like, fuck you, I'm just like word salad. And, that kind of gave a whole generation of writers permission to just cut loose, and
Permission's a good word.
Yeah. Or encouragement even.
Yeah.
Right? Gave them
inspiration.
Gave them the door open to just run amok. I mean, and some used it to very good purpose. Henry Miller is another one. But Henry Miller, with all due respect, needed a really good editor, or needed to become a really good editor of his own, Henry Miller didn't like to kill his darlings,
Yeah.
And I think he's one of the most brilliant writers of all time. But, if he would have, my books, I write the book, much like Kerouac, just spew it out there, word salad, whatever. And then I go back and probably did 50 or 60 edits of each one of my books myself. Because I learned that as a writer, I'm wearing two hats. I'm wearing the hat of the wild child that's just running, trampling through the fucking flower patch, catching butterflies and, pissing and shitting wherever he wants. And then you put that kid to bed after he's done his job, and you put on your spectacles and your robe and your ascot, and you sit down and edit the shit out of that over and over again. And pretty soon, at some point, then you'll let the kid back in and go, hey, what do you think, kid? And it becomes a collaboration between the wild spirit of Kerouac and the sort of editor that needs to make things readable so that people aren't just like, what the fuck, after the 900th page of gibberish. You got to take that and that rough gem and, polish it into something of value and something that's, nice to look at, or at least palatable, right? So that's something that I am eternally grateful to have been given that sense, that
ability
sense
to kill your babies.
Just enough self-awareness to be able to say this is shit to your own thing. Or maybe I could just take this out and put it in the corner and maybe use it somewhere else later, so I don't have to kill it. I'll just put it in a fucking, put it on standby somewhere, but yeah. And I think, Henry Miller would have done well to have, had a bit more of that spirit, It's like, let's tone this down. Because some of this stuff is pure genius, and then you go on for 3 pages of just like, what?
What are you going to write next?
I've got a lot of stuff that I started writing and didn't finish. I've got a lot of stuff that I could publish right now that I just haven't bothered with. Got a lot of short stories, I've got a lot of stuff on ice that I just have not bothered with. And then I've got the 3rd and 4th and 5th books of this series. Book 3 is sort of, I started writing it and then I just got overwhelmed by all the material. And it's just like, whoop, can't go there. So it's just sitting there waiting for something to touch me and say, get back to it. So I've got a lot of stuff that wants to be written.
I'll tell you, from my perspective, the world needs people like you to create more, because there's a lot of garbage out there. And everybody's conforming to this victim mentality type thing.
Yep. Yeah.
It'd be great if you went on a tear and broke some of those.
The thing is, I got very discouraged at some point as a writer. I think that's probably what led me into me putting, no pun intended, but putting my literary work on the shelf, no pun intended, because what happened was I came out with some really great books. My first book, Narcissa, was pretty, was critically acclaimed, like for what it's worth. It got some buzz critically from the powers that be. It was a great fucking book. Then I wrote these 2 memoirs, and they're also great works of literature. I say that with all humility because I didn't write them, at least not alone. And they never really went anywhere. And then I got disgusted. And I think this is largely unconscious on my part, but I think something inside me got hurt to the point where it's like, fuck everybody, I'm not going to write anymore because they don't appreciate it, because nobody reads anymore. Like the writers of the 30s and the 40s, all those guys, some of them even mediocre, Scott Fitzgerald, Hemingway, they were fucking superstars, man. They were the rock stars of their time. And that don't happen so much anymore unless you're a mediocre writer. There's so many shit works out there that are getting fame and acclaim, and people are making money writing this shit. And then, somebody writes a great book. Jerry's another one, victim of that. Jerry Stahl, victim, can't, people are not, he can't support himself with his writing. You know, he used to be a very famous screenwriter in Hollywood, and he started writing all these great books. Nobody read them. You know, I mean, reasonable. I mean, sure, he's got a cult following like I do, but nobody really reads this stuff, you know? So I think at some point we get butthurt by that situation. And suddenly I realized, well, everybody watches a documentary. That's why I agreed to do the documentary. If the documentary could be, you know, encapsulate the essence of what I'm writing in these books, maybe it could serve as an infomercial for the books. Maybe somebody might want to read them. That would be cool, you know. I would like to deliver my work to an actual audience. I mean, I'm writing to save my soul, yes. But at the same time, I'd also like to be able to interact with my fellow human beings through the written word. And so the movie turned out to be a focus for me because, you know, it's just a better way in today's, you know, sort of TikTok culture to be able to interact more with your fellows. Does that make sense?
It does, but
I mean, I still want to write.
The other side of it is if you were doing more volume, eventually it's going to catch up because you can't keep that stuff. Like, we're going to hand it around and people are going to talk about it. And so if you just...
Well, my first book, Narcissa, is really popular in prison. Some guy, some convict got a hold of a copy of the book and it made the rounds of the whole fucking prison, and they were writing to me like, well, man, your book really...
But that might be the lesson of Bukowski's. He did a lot of volume.
He did.
And if you can tap into that thing, let the volume go and people are going to find it. Because there isn't enough of that right now. And you would, in a sense, there aren't too many writers like that giving permission to these younger kids that they have an example.
No, you're right.
Of that sort of authentic, don't take yourself so seriously. Yeah. We're not all, you know, Instagram stars. And so, you know.
No, you're right.
Fucking special all the time.
No, this is very inspiring because...
But volume, just start doing it.
Just crank it out. I've got so much stuff that's just sitting there, man.
Don't question it. Just let it go.
You know, Jerry just sent me a thing where he's an old guy like me. Like, I think we're born the same year. So we're both like 71 years old. And he just started doing something with this thing called Substack. I have no idea what that is. But he said you put your stuff out. So he was telling me about this Substack thing. And I was like, wow, that might be a way to start putting stuff out.
If you start doing the volume, there's a bunch of places you can put it out.
Because I did that a while ago, and I did it in the wrong place, and the reactions were like not good. And that was like, God, that's probably...
You know what's interesting that nobody does is nobody's making fun of all this political stuff like Hunter did.
Oh, Jesus.
Nobody's telling the truth about any of that. It's like everybody's
scared. Everybody's terrified.
Yeah, but it takes somebody to step up and laugh at it.
My little brother, Johnny Depp, said in an interview brilliantly, he said, you know, everybody is just dying to say something, but they can't. I mean,
you could.
But they can't because they're terrified of being canceled.
Yeah, but you don't care.
I don't care. I'm uncancelable. Yeah. I've canceled myself a long fucking time ago. I'm like
Tap
Charlie
into
Manson,
that thing
man.
And let it come.
I canceled myself a long time ago, man. So
my favorite Hunter thing, and like a lot of his political stuff was so great, but I forget what the magazine is. I have it at home in a case because it's highly collectible. But he wrote, it wasn't Rolling Stone, it was another magazine. He wrote an article about the Kentucky Derby. Yeah. And it starts off with the line, he walks in or whatever, and he says, what's the bestiality scene here?
Oh.
Which I just think is so great because they're worshiping horses. And he's like, what's this worship of horses? What's the bestiality scene here?
Yeah.
It's so funny. It's, you know, he's making fun of, oh, we're all here for horses?
Yeah.
Like, we're all dressed up for horses? We got the hats and the mint
juleps. Yeah.
But nobody's doing that kind of stuff where they're just kind of like, you know, making fun of it, but also pointing out that, hey, this is this isn't really doing what it's supposed to be doing.
There's so much. I mean, these are the most apocalyptic. We're living in the apocalypse, man. no matter what point of view you have of all things.
But that's how they felt then. That's how they felt during Nixon. It was the end of the world. It'll never get worse than this.
It got a lot worse.
Vietnam, remember? But those writers were narrating that. They were telling they were making fun of it.
The fact is that the mass psychosis that took place and that still takes place, you know, it's like, I think who said it the other day? I was listening to, I think it was Jordan Peterson, who was quoting somebody. I think he was quoting Carl Jung or somebody like that. And he said, psychopathy is very rare in individuals, but extremely prevalent in masses.
In the crowd, yeah.
Yeah. Think of that, you know? And that's what I'm seeing.
But no, there's no artist stepping up, making fun of it, or
because they'll get fucking guillotined, man. They'll get shot.
Nobody worried about that then.
I'm not worried about it either. I'm
just trying to plant a little seed that it'd be real fun if somebody with ear talent just started creating.
I'm gonna start cranking out shit.
Gave a little relief to the bullshit.
You got me. I'm going to work.
Tell the truth.
I'm going back to work.
Make fun of it. It'd be fun.
Yeah, got to.
Well, thank you for doing this.
Thank you, brother. This has been a rare pleasure.